Alright, hey guys, we're here for Chapter 8, China and the World, East Asian Connections. And before we get started with Section 1, I'd like to just go over a couple of things, talk to you about some things. A few regions receive as much attention as China in AP World History. Not only is China a large population center during practically all eras covered by the course, but it also has vibrant interactions with the surrounding areas. And Chapter 8 places specific emphasis on these interactions, and it's a great chapter. The mix of political, economic, and social history makes this chapter significant. Now, the consequences of increased agricultural productivity during the Tang and Sung dynasties are vast, and we'll look at those in Section 1. And I want you really to consider how this expansion of agricultural productivity affected Chinese urbanization, trade, and political complexity in the long term. So let's start with Section 1, together again, the reemergence of a unified China. Oh, this is a great picture. What do you see here? Okay, we see a bearded Chinese scholar, right? You can tell by the instruments. And a colorful robe, looks like it's got some dragons on it. Next to this globe, right, which, and even was probably an astronomer's instrument, like a sextant. S-E-X-T-A-N. I'm not sure if any of you have ever heard of a sextant before. Above the globe and the sextant are a number of, looks like maybe some Chinese writing symbols. The background transitions from what might be a starry night. And then the top right, to lighter across the sky. In the top right-hand corner, next to his cap, is some other type of Chinese inscription. Can you explain why this image was printed in Japan? Because it was actually printed in Japan. Well, with all of the Chinese influences that you see, and it's printed in Japan, that would probably lead you to believe that Chinese astronomers discovered, based on the picture, actually discovered a remarkable number of astronomic phenomena. Sunspots, good example, solar and lunar eclipses. And the Chinese also led in astronomical cartography and the design and construction of these types of instruments. And the Japanese were profoundly influenced by Chinese astronomers. The Japanese origin of this celebratory picture illustrates that. So what does this image tell us about Chinese culture at the beginning of the second millennium? Well, China had not only developed deep traditions in state building and the military and religious practices, it also enjoyed a leading role in science and technology long before European nations committed to science and innovation in the Enlightenment. Excuse me. China was a major player among the third wave civilizations. Many today actually believe that China will be the next superpower. But China was a major player during the third wave civilizations. This is a China-centered world order that encompassed most of Eastern Asia. Their borders reach far into Central Asia, and its wealthy and cosmopolitan culture attracted many visitors from afar. And all of China's neighbors felt its gravitational pull. China's economy and technology or technological innovation had effects throughout all of Eurasia. China was also changed by its interactions with non-Chinese people. The nomadic military threat, especially from the north, in the international trade amongst China and other countries was a catalyst of change. And the Han Dynasty collapsed about 200 to 20. It led to 300 years of political fragmentation. There's a nomadic incursion from the north. Conditions discredited Confucianism in many people's eyes. Chinese migration southward to the Yangtze River Valley began. Then we come to a golden age of Chinese achievement. The Sui dynasty, 589-618, reunified China. The rulers vastly extended the canal system, but their ruthlessness and failure to conquer Korea alienated a lot of people and exhausted many of the state's resources. Eventually, the dynasty was overthrown, but the state, or the idea of centralization, didn't disintegrate. Both the Han and Roman empires collapsed, but China was reunified under the Sui dynasty. And there were many achievements, such as like I talked about, the expansion of the canals. And albeit it was a short-lived dynasty, their emperors were harsh, continued to make war and try to conquer Korea, and they were unsuccessful. But the idea of centralization continued. The Tang and Sung dynasties were noteworthy for their political achievements, but also for their cultural vibrancy and economic dynamism. Now, the Tang and Sung dynasties were built on Sui foundations. They established patterns of Chinese life that lasted into the 20th century. And this was regarded really as a golden age of the arts and literature. And so it's not just their political achievements, but the cultural vibrancy and the economic accomplishments are also of note here. All right, let's look at Tang and Sung politics. There were 6 major ministries that were created, along with the censorate for the surveillance over the government. The examination system was revived to staff the bureaucracy. The proliferation of schools and colleges, even a large share of official positions went to sons of the elite. And large landowners continued to be powerful despite state efforts to redistribute land to peasants. And actually, you'll see that pattern that has existed in China throughout thousands of years. That idea of taking the land and redistributing it to the peasants, the idea of peasants are the backbone of the nation. But the bureaucracy and the exam system, they really, the dynasties really formalized and expanded these systems and expanded the Confucian-based exam system. In theory, they cracked down on cheating. The exams were open to all, regardless of class, despite most of those positions going to the sons of the elite. But there were irregularities. So they had an economic advantage. They could pay for the schooling and the education and tutors. Nonetheless, schools and colleges all grew in number, and the system that trained the efficient bureaucracy that governed China was an apparent success. Now, the economic boom, population growth, and urbanization. Let's take a look at that. It was kind of like an economic revolution under the Sung dynasty. Great prosperity, a rapid population growth, about 50 or 60 million people during the Tang dynasty to about 120 million by 1200. And that's basically doubling in size. Great improvements in agricultural production. Remember I talked about that at the beginning of the chapter. China was the most urbanized region in the world. They had great networks of internal waterways like canals and rivers and lakes. And great improvements were made in industrial production. And here we see the invention of print, both woodblock printing and movable type. Now, the best navigational and shipbuilding technology was also found here, along with the invention of gunpowder. So, thanks to investments in their infrastructure, like the canal system, that allowed for cheap transportation of rice and wheat over long distances, and that was a major economic boom during this time. And in addition to the staples, the things that farmers had to have, they could produce specialized crops for specific markets. More food meant more people, right? That leads to the doubling of the population. And the cities saw tremendous growth in the development of increasingly productive and sophisticated industries. And this boom did have a clear environmental consequences, as much of China's old growth forests were being cut down for fuel. But the production for the market rather than for local consumption was widespread. Cheap transportation, like I said, allowed peasants to grow specialized crops. And another pattern we've seen throughout history, the government demanded payment of taxes actually in cash as opposed to crops. And so this is where also we see the use of paper money and the growing use of paper money and even other types of financial instruments that could serve as currency. One of the one of the world's largest cities is here in China, the Hangzhou. At this point in time, a population of over 1 million, vibrant cultural life, lively entertainment industry, and even a growing print culture. Restaurants, various types of inns, even specialized agencies that managed elaborate parties, especially for the elite. They had music schools, even distinct clubs that provided companionship, where people could go and join and partake in activities of people that have the same interests, like poets, fishermen, Buddhists, actually physical fitness enthusiasts, collectors of different items, horse lovers, etc. All kinds of different clubs. So this was a real cosmopolitan, modern, chic city in one of the world's largest cities. Huge population. Like I said, more than 1 million people. So here's a map that gives you a good idea. You see in purple is the Qin Empire. It's up here in the north. And then you see the southern Song Empire there in the green. The Grand Canal that we talked about, that vast canal system they began building. And the red is the Great Wall of China. And the Tang Dynasty, which came before the Song Dynasty, reached in a much wider area. You can see down here is South Asia and India, and we get over here into Central Asia right here. So you can see that they extend in a much further direction. There's a pretty big desert right here, which probably is a good indicator as to why the territory is narrowed. But this gives you a good idea of where these empires were located. Well, despite this being a type of golden age for Chinese achievement, it was not so golden for many of the women. During the Tang Dynasty, elite women in the north had been allowed... Okay, sorry about that. Got interrupted by one of my daughters. Okay, during the Tang Dynasty, elite women in the north had been allowed greater freedoms. And this was probably because of the influence from the nomads along the grasslands, the steppes. During the Sung Dynasty, there was a tightening of patriarchal restrictions on women. Literature even highlighted the subjugation of women, and foot binding started in the 10th or 11th century, which is during the Sung Dynasty. Foot binding, believe it or not, it was associated with the images of female beauty and eroticism, despite the fact that women were seen as weak and distracting. And that really is part of this whole system. It kept women restricted to the house. And I've got an image for you. It's painful. Well, it's painful looking. But textile production was done on a larger scale, and this displaced women from their traditional role in the industry. Women found other roles in cities, and the prosperity of the elite created a demand for concubines, entertainers, prostitutes, courtesans. In some ways, the position of women actually improved. Property rights expanded. More women were educated in order to raise better sons. But the Tang freedoms and the Sung patriarchy, elite women enjoyed various freedoms, and that's because of the cultural influence, like I said, of those nomads. The Song era really renewed that patriarchy system that was based on the conservative views of Confucius. And, men were to be scholars and administrators, and women were viewed, like I said, as weak and distracting. And thus we see the foot binding. And this practice was hugely popular during the Sung Dynasty. And it's actually associated with the construction of frail beauty. And it restricted the freedom of women. And the... I want to give you a little more on textile production. The commercialization of weaving, for example, that's where many were pushed out of the textile labor force. But they found, like I said, they found new jobs, domestic service, retail, entertainment, like I said, concubines and others. So, but there was an increase in those property rights and access to education. And here's that picture of foot binding that I wanted to show you. Oh gosh. Look at this photograph. So we've got freckles on these darkly tanned hands. And it's an old woman washing her feet in a wooden vat. One foot is resting inside the vat. But she's holding up the other, and it's relatively pale, isn't it, compared to the color of her hands? And it's an incredibly thin lower leg. Yeah, the foot's almost unrecognizable. Toes are pushed inward to the center. Oh, yep, these are the toes. The rest of the foot is pushed upward. See that right there? And this deformity is the result of the tradition of foot binding. And they were forced to submit to that. So although foot binding clearly deformed and crippled women's feet, like I said, it was associated with beauty. And they were encased in these tiny and elaborately decorated shoes. So while foot binding destroyed the natural aesthetic of a woman's foot, it created in the views of many Chinese a new and decorative beauty. It actually emerged during the Sung Dynasty as a practice among dancers and courtesans, and became very popular. It was like I said, part of that tightening patriarchal order. Women were, with their bound feet, were admired for their frailty, daintiness, and their disability largely confined them to the home. And this meant that they had servants for errands and housework because they couldn't do it. And that showed a sign of being elite. So that was, bound feet were a symbol of upper class status. And there you go. It's that tiny little decorative shoe. So if you think about it, foot binding really affected the lives of women that were exposed to this practice. It seems difficult to imagine that anyone with such a deformed foot could walk without pain or wear shoes other than these small decorative silk ones. The practice reduced women to decorative dolls in the cruelest way. Ugh. And of course, this didn't mean the women with bound feet were even fully embraced such a submissive identity, which is also entirely possible. And that's it.